So I'm here with Dr. Mark Goodacre. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So I got to say, I've been a longtime fan of yours because you've been a longtime podcaster. I would say you're like one of the OG New Testament podcasters with the NT Pod. I think as long as I've been social media aware, your podcast has been in this world. So I would just be curious to hear, when did you start this podcast? What inspired you to start it? Because you really were on the cutting edge.
Yeah, I really love doing it actually, and one of the difficult things about being a university professor, tenure professor is the best job in the whole world. So I don't want to come across as complaining, but you do end up, if you're a good administrator, getting asked to do more administration, and that takes you away from it. And it's funny you should ask, because I was actually just looking at my NT Pod archives yesterday. And it's quite horrifying to see how in the first 2 or 3 years of it, I was doing an episode every 2 weeks. And then this gets down to like an episode, like 2 episodes a year. And I've actually recently stood down as department chair. So I'm hoping to get back to it. But yes, I started it in 2009, and I've done 99 episodes plus a few extended episodes. And we're about to hit 100 and 101, which are actually in the can and ready to release when I've got time.
Yeah, and I started Religion for Breakfast in 2014. So you really you got a few years on me. But there's that whole first mover idea. You kind of claim the spot as one of the premier podcasts by being there so early.
It's funny to think, isn't it? I mean, and there wasn't really a lot of YouTubing back then. So the idea of doing anything visual didn't, at least like with video, didn't occur to me. It has since. I mean, one of the things that I'm hoping to do is launch. Well, I've already got a video channel, a YouTube channel, but it hasn't got much on it at the minute. But one thing that I want to do is every now and then, and I know you find this on your podcast because you use visual media a lot. So if you're talking about tombs, you show people the tombs. That's one of the problems with the audio medium. Sometimes I'm talking about things and I think I really want to show my listeners what I'm talking about. So I've decided that one thing I'll try and do is use video where I can use that medium. And actually, if I need to show a picture, I can show a picture. So I mean, that is one of the exciting things about where we are. But of course, the problem with video stuff is it takes far longer to do than the audio.
Yeah, I got to say it's not just double the length and difficulty. It's 10 times more, because then you have to light a studio and make sure you have some on-screen presence. Like how do you act on camera? But I agree with you. Like if you can say something in 10 words with the object on screen, hey, look at this inscription on screen, as opposed to trying to describe it with 30 words, like just the economy of language there. Like the video is powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I would say one of the things that you're best known for is being a scholar of the Synoptic Gospels. And that term synoptic is a little bit jargony. So can you tell us, for the audience, what are the Synoptic Gospels and why are they called synoptic?
Sure. Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke. So we take John out of the equation. And the reason you take John out of the equation is that it's much harder to put John in parallel to the other three. So synoptic is really, the optic bit is the seeing bit, the syn bit is the together bit. So the Synoptic Gospels are seeing Matthew, Mark, and Luke together, and putting John to one side. So that's the kind of thing there. And I just got into it because I like a puzzle. And when I started studying the Synoptic Gospels when I was an undergrad, I realized that I just wasn't persuaded by one of the major theses that surround the Q hypothesis. And I think if you have that, if your intellectual curiosity is aroused, it's very difficult then to put it down. So that's really where my interest in the synoptics comes from, is the kind of love of a puzzle.
So there's 4 Gospels in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The first 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are seen together, synoptic. And it's because, correct me if I'm wrong, it's because they have similar stories in a similar chronology, even sometimes word for word agreement. Am I right in that characterization?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the degree of agreement between Matthew, Mark, and Luke is just phenomenal. I mean, I really mean that. I'm not overstating it. If you compare it to other texts which we know knew each other in antiquity, the degree of agreement between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's through the roof sometimes. They go on for whole sentences, apparently one or the other, or more than one, doing some copying from the others. And then it's not just the verbatim agreement on the level of individual words and sentences, it's also the whole structure. You've got parallels in order that can only be explained in a literary way. And that's where John differs, because it's much harder to make the case that John was in any way literarily familiar with the other three. Although I think he was, but that's for another day.
Yeah, maybe for another day. So you mentioned that you love a puzzle, and people, scholars call this the synoptic problem, because they're trying to figure out why is there so much agreement. So can you mentioned Q, and so maybe explain to the audience what the Q hypothesis is and your response to it. Your book on the matter is one of the books I read in graduate school. Like, it is kind of a standard text now on this issue.
Cool. Yeah, it came out in 2002, and I still get royalties. Not many royalties, but tiny little bit from it every 6 months or so. So I know that people are still reading it, which is lovely. I never thought that would be the case. I thought it was Sync without trace, especially as I was writing something that was pretty off the beaten track, if we're frank, and it was quite difficult to get a publisher. It was turned down. Before it was published by Trinity Press International, but it was turned down by another press before that. I won't name them, but the Q hypothesis is basically the idea that Matthew and Luke wrote independently of one another. So they used Mark's gospel. I'm agreed on that. Everyone's agreed on that. But saying that Matthew and Luke use Mark will only explain the stuff they've got in common with Mark. And you've got a whole bunch of stuff in Matthew and Luke that's not in Mark. And it includes this verbatim stuff that goes on for sentences at a time. So it's like, where does this material come from? And the classic answer is, it comes from a document that's got lost, which, because we don't know anything about it, we just call it Q, which is the first letter of the German word Quelle, which means source. So it's just basically saying, well, Matthew and Luke must have had another source apart from Mark. So that's where the Q hypothesis comes from.
And your intervention into this space is basically saying, well, Q doesn't exist. That, I forget the exact argument, but basically that Matthew copied Mark, and then Luke copied Mark and Matthew. In some respects, it's kind of like an Occam's razor, where it's like the simplest explanation is just the sources we already have. Like, why hypothesize this hypothetical source?
Yeah, it's always good when you're attacking a problem to at least begin with the most straightforward solution. You know, if I have two students who produce really, really similar work, and only those two, the first thing that I think is, which one's copied off for the other one? Now, it's possible they've both copied off a third source that I've not seen. You have to keep that possibility alive. But what you do is you say, has, Julie copied off Mike, or has Mike copied off Julie? And have a look. And the benefits, of course, these days is I can get one into my office and then interview them, and another one in my office and interview them. And with any luck, one of them will confess. But we can't do that with Matthew and Luke. So what we have to do is do it by literary analysis. And so my basic point is, well, look, if you can see lots of Matthew's fingerprints, lots of Matthew's DNA in Luke's gospel, then it makes much more sense to say that Luke copied from Matthew than to say that there was some source that we've never seen that's got lost, somewhere, and just to be clear, Occam's razor doesn't necessarily mean that, you always reject things that are hypothetical or things that are lost or things like that. It's just that you begin with the most straightforward, simple explanation and see if that makes sense of the data. And in my opinion, it doesn't just make sense of the data, it makes beautiful sense of the data. It explains to me the whole development of the gospel tradition. You begin with Mark that explodes with this exciting, brand new kind of, idea of writing a life of Jesus. And then Matthew kind of goes, well, I can improve on that. And then Luke says, well, I can improve on that too. I'm going to use the Matthean model, but I'm going to go back to Mark, and it's just, to me, there's a glorious simplicity in the way that it begins to explain the development of the gospel tradition. Definitely.
Though, of course, here in the 21st century, it's not just if Mike and Julie were copying from each other. Maybe they use ChatGPT and just...
Yeah. Yeah, we've got to worry about that now. Yeah, definitely.
So we always talk about the four gospels. In fact, I think some of the patristics, some of the church fathers use similar terms like, oh, just like there are four directions, the four cardinal directions, there must only be four gospels. But in recent decades, especially since the discovery of the Nag Hammadi codices, the so-called Gnostic scriptures discovered in the mid-20th century, there's this phrase, the fifth gospel, the Gospel of Thomas. And you've written a book on this subject because it implicates the Synoptic Gospels. Did the Gospel of Thomas copy from the Synoptic Gospels? Did Thomas know the Synoptics? So maybe let's back up a bit and explain to the audience what is the Gospel of Thomas, and then we can get into this question.
Sure. I mean, and just before saying something the Gospel of Thomas is, I do love that description of it as the fifth gospel, although I do think it's a little bit like trying to say who was the fifth Beatle. Is it Brian Epstein? Is it George Martin? I mean, and if you do start getting into is it the fifth gospel, you then have to say, well, okay, what about all the others? But briefly, what the Gospel of Thomas is, it's a sayings gospel. It doesn't have the kind of narrative structure that you see in the four canonical gospels. And really, you could actually take the sayings in it and jumble them around, and you probably wouldn't notice a great deal of difference. So the structure is very different. There's no passion narrative. There's no crucifixion, resurrection. There are no Jesus miracles. So it's mainly just Jesus as a talking head. He does interact with people. People come up to him and ask him questions and things, but that's mainly what it is. So it's this fascinating piece of literature, this sayings gospel where Jesus comes across like this kind of talking sage, like this kind of wise man who imparts his wisdom to the disciples.
Yeah, it really reads like a book of Proverbs or even like Confucius's Analects, where it's just sayings from a wise person. Some of them are just a single sentence, and some are a little bit longer. Maybe there's a dialogue between the disciples, but it really is markedly different than the Gospels that we know of in the New Testament, where they're more biographical. A story happens. In some cases, in Matthew and Luke, Jesus is born, then he's an adult, then he's crucified. So Gospel of Thomas, nothing of the sort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, the shortest one in Thomas is the shortest saying is just two words: "Be passers by." And no one quite knows what that means, but yeah, and then there are longer things, like there are parables in there, and there are kind of short dialogues. But yes, it's always quite pithy and quite enigmatic.
So one of the most interesting things about the Gospel of Thomas, or something that really interests me, is that a lot of the sayings have obvious parallels in the Synoptic Gospels. So I have a few examples here that I can show on screen, but I'll just read them here. But, Thomas Logion number 34. Jesus said, if a blind person leads a blind person, they both fall into a pit. So that's saying number 34. It is an obvious parallel to Matthew 15:14. Let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind. And if one blind person guides another, both will fall into a pit. So obvious parallel there. And that raises the question, what you just said, when you see two students with similar work, is Thomas copying Matthew? Is Matthew copying Thomas? Is Mark, is Mark somewhere in the equation? So can you explain what the debate here is, whether or not Thomas knew the synoptics?
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary, really, when you read Thomas, because if you have never read it before, but you are familiar with the Synoptic Gospels, as you read Thomas, it's this really strange mixture of the familiar and the unfamiliar. So as you're walking through, you think, oh, I know this one. Oh, I don't know this one. Oh, I know this one. It's almost like, if there's a band that like their greatest hits album. Like, I'm a big fan of ABBA, and when you go along to see the ABBA Voyage concert, you look around the room and you can see loads of people that have clearly only got ABBA Gold. So you get anything that's not an ABBA Gold, they go, what's this? That's what it's like reading the Gospel of Thomas. If you only know the synoptics, about 50% of Thomas has got parallels in the synoptics. It's kind of interesting. You never go on for very long without it. So you'll get something like synoptic parallel, synoptic parallel, synoptic parallel, and then new saying, new saying, new saying, and then synoptic, new, synoptic, new, synoptic, synoptic. It kind of interlaces. And yeah, and cases like the one you mentioned, the blind leading the blind. I mean, that one always reminds me of The Life of Brian, where the blind man actually does fall into the pit. Actually, it's not a blind man leading a blind man, but a blind man does actually get into the pit, and I think it's inspired by that saying. But again, a little bit like talking about the question about did Luke know Matthew and was there a queue? The first question for me will always be, did Thomas know the Synoptic Gospels? Because if you see all those parallels, then the first thought is, well, could it be that Thomas has just got them from the Synoptics? But there's a huge there's a huge group of people who think that Thomas was probably independent of the Synoptic Gospels, who think that it wasn't exactly from a kind of hypothetical written source in this case, but from a kind of groups of oral traditions, and that maybe, you start with the oral tradition and this trickles down to Matthew, it trickles down to Luke, it trickles down to Mark, and it trickles down to Thomas. So you have all four of those Synoptic Gospels accessing the same oral tradition stuff. And that has been, I wouldn't say it's ever been a consensus, but it's certainly been a very popular view ever since the Gospel of Thomas was properly discovered in 1945. That's been a very common view. And I don't believe it. I actually think that Thomas knew Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Well, it's a seductive view because it would be an additional source of the historical Jesus. Like, oh, wow, this might give us a more primitive example of one of the sayings of Jesus before it was meddled with by Matthew or Luke.
Yeah, exactly. And to be honest, when I started working on Thomas, I desperately hoped that I would be convinced of that view, because it would be so exciting if there was another source, not even just back to the historical Jesus, but just a source that somehow gave us a different take on the early Christian tradition. And so I must admit, as I started studying Thomas, I would say, gosh, when was it? 25 years ago. I actually didn't read it at university at all when I was doing my undergrad degree. And I don't remember reading it while I was doing my doctoral studies either, which is kind of shameful. You would never get that now. But anyway, I got to it when I began my first job in the late 90s, and I remember reading it with great excitement. And the longer I looked at it, I thought, oh gosh, so here's the thing. If you spent as long as I have staring at the Synoptic Gospels, you kind of get used to seeing particular characteristics of particular Gospels. So you'll get used to the way that Luke rephrases something from Mark, and you'll get used to particular expressions that Luke uses. And I started seeing those in Thomas. Same with Matthew. Things that for me were very clear examples of Matthew editing Mark that then showed up in Thomas. And to me, then it's impossible that came from some pre-Mark and oral tradition. So any hope I had that it might be a witness to some primitive oral tradition fairly quickly eroded when I saw what I thought were Matthean and Lucan characteristics showing up. And after that, I then thought, I actually have to try and see if this is sustained throughout. And in my opinion, it is. When you actually look through it, all of those synoptic parallels are best explained by Thomas's knowledge of the literary texts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and not just by some kind of oral tradition that they share.
So I know this will be asking you to reach back in your memory from a book you published in 2012, but do you have any examples of these Matthean or Lucan examples or, hints in the Gospel of Thomas? Because the scholars that argue that it is, drawing from an oral vocabulary, as it were, and this explains why there's slight differences here and there and not lengthy, there aren't lengthy examples. Matthew and Luke have entire sentences from Mark, but we don't have like huge paragraphs drawing from the synoptics into Thomas. So it's not quite so obvious.
Yeah. I mean, the longest verbatim agreement that you get is about 13 words in the Greek, and it's the parable about, well, not the parable, the sort of the saying about the brother that takes a speck from his brother's eye while he's got a log in his own. But that's that. There you have a really close agreement. But yeah, I'll give an example from Luke in Gospel of Thomas 79. You have a saying where there's a woman in the crowd, and the woman in the crowd said, "Blessed is the womb that gave birth to you and the breasts that nourished you." And Jesus says, "Blessed rather is the one who hears the word of God and keeps it." That was one of the first things that I noticed when I was reading through Thomas, because I thought that saying was something that was composed by Luke. And I thought it was fairly straightforward to argue it's composed by Luke, because every single thing in that exchange is Lucan. The theology of it, hearing the word of God and doing it, you can see it repeatedly in Luke's gospel. The idea of a woman standing up in the crowd and saying something with this kind of foil question, which Jesus responds to, again, it's very Lucan. And even the imagery, Luke is the one amongst the evangelists who uses that kind of gynecological imagery a good deal. So I looked at that and I thought, I think that Thomas has picked this up from Luke's gospel. It's in Luke chapter 11, 27 to 28. And it's just pops in, Luke, just after the Beelzebub controversy, in a very similar position to where you have the mother and brother story in Matthew's gospel. And I just thought, that has to be Thomas pulling it from Luke. So that's a kind of example of the kind of thing I mean, that something that just sounds very like a snippet of Luke's gospel. And you can do the same thing for Matthew. So perhaps one of the easiest examples with Matthew is the parable of the wheat and the tares, which comes in Matthew 13. It's a version, I think, of a parable from Mark 4, called The Seed Growing Secretly. And what happens is the Markan parable is quite bland. Not a lot happens in it. And Matthew kind of spruces it up and makes it much more like a kind of harvest, heaven and hell, apocalyptic scenario thing. And then that shows up in Thomas. And you think, hold on a minute, how has Thomas got the Matthean version of this rather plain Markan parable? And then, to make it even more interesting, Thomas also has the Markan parable without the Matthean additions to it in a different context. So, and Thomas just loves the synoptic parables. I mean, he especially loves the harvest ones. So he's got those definitely in the brain, and they're sort of laced throughout the gospel. He has the parable of the sower, the parable of the mustard seed. He just loves that stuff. So that's sort of what I was getting at with the book, that it's just so unlikely that Thomas is accessing some hypothetical, kind of stream of oral tradition rather than the written gospels.
And this tells us something possibly about the dating of Thomas as well, because if Thomas is drawing from Mark, Matthew, and Luke, presumably then we're talking about a 2nd century text. I know that April DeConnick, who's a scholar of Gnosticism, has again this very seductive theory that at least a portion of Thomas is this kernel that goes all the way back to the 1st century. And you're saying that just is not sustainable.
Yeah, I really love DeConnick's work, and I found it quite inspirational in my own work on the Gospel of Thomas. But one of the things that's interesting about her kernel, Thomas, it always sounds weird saying kernel with a British accent, because it sounds like kernel, like Colonel, but anyway, it's Kernel, that kernel Thomas. But if you look at her kernel, virtually every single one of those sayings is one of the synoptic parallels in Thomas. So I kind of agree with her in a way about the kernel, because I think that Thomas probably did begin with some kind of kernel of synoptic sayings that he really liked, that he wanted to include. It's just that I don't think that he got them from the oral tradition. I think he got them directly from the synoptics. But yeah, you're right. The dating is a little disappointing if we were hoping for a fresh 1st century gospel. And I think Thomas probably dates to the late 130s, maybe even as late as 140s or 150, because it seems to have a reference to the Bar Kokhba revolt, which took place in 135. And that's kind of difficult if you want to push it early. And of course, you could say, well, that's a later layer and all the rest of it. I'm not a big fan of layers. I think that part of it, the thing about textual scholars like me is that we're all basically frustrated archaeologists. We really want to kind of believe we're doing archaeology, and we're not. We're doing literary analysis. And so we kind of go in and we try and layer the text and say, well, here's the latest redaction and here's an earlier piece. And And I mean, I love all that scholarship, but I just don't believe it. I just don't think doing literary analysis is like doing archaeology. So, no, I don't think you can dig down into Thomas and find an early kind of primitive layer, except insofar as you can see the synoptic parallel. So, yeah, I think Thomas is well into the second century. So, post dates the synoptics, not by a lot. I mean, I put Luke pretty late. I think Luke knew Josephus. So, I think that Luke has to be early second century. So Thomas is not a lot later than that, I don't think, but it is still later than that definitely.
Yeah. I mean, it's still impressively early for one of these texts. I mean, like you said, Luke and Acts very possibly are early second century. So we're just talking a matter of decades here.
Mm-hmm. And also, it's worth remembering that Thomas was hugely influential in antiquity. It's not like, a lot of the Gospels that have been rediscovered in the last century or two we've never heard of. Like Gospel of Mary doesn't leave any trace in people's discussions in antiquity, for example. We weren't looking for a Gospel of Mary and it turns up. It was wonderful when it turned up. Gospel of Philip, it's very difficult to know what kind of impact that had. But Gospel of Thomas, people actually mention it, talk about it, quote it. Origen quotes it a couple of times. So we know that the ancients knew it pretty well, and that itself speaks to its relative antiquity.
And of course, it raises all these interesting questions about the editorial decisions that Thomas must have been making. This is something that comes up in your research on Q. Like, one of the main arguments for the Q document is that why would Luke and Matthew have different birth stories? Like, wouldn't they try to harmonize that? And you're like, well, these are, editors making their own editorial decisions. So maybe Luke decided to drop the story of the Magi because he didn't want it. And when it comes to Thomas, which is just a collection of wise sayings, like the editor of Thomas decided to chop out entire stories if indeed he was sitting in front of a copy of Matthew and Luke and Mark.
Well, I think, right, exactly. And I think one of the questions, so New Testament scholars, they get the question slightly wrong. They keep asking the question, why is Luke so different from Matthew? Why is Thomas so different from the Synoptics? It's the wrong question. The question should be, why are they so similar? Because if you're using another document as a source, you want to do your own thing. You've got your own voice. The fascinating thing about these early Christian texts is why they're so similar. So when you look at Luke's gospel, why does Luke copy? I mean, this is obviously framing it in my own terms, but why does Luke copy out so much of Matthew's gospel? The birth narratives are much less surprising. That's exactly the kind of thing you'd expect someone to do in antiquity. You read the Proto-Evangelium of James, the Proto-Gospel of James. That's like massively different from Matthew and Luke, and most people think that Proto-Evangelium of James used Matthew and Luke. What you do is you do different things. You riff on your source. So in a way, the differences are always, I think, the difference is the easy thing. What's fascinating is why they're so similar. Why does Thomas, for example, want to quote all of that synoptic material? Why does Luke want to quote all that material from Matthew and Mark? That's I think is the right question, not why they're so different. And I do worry that maybe I've just got some kind of deep psychological problem where I just want to be a spoil sport and just throw a grenade into the room. And I must admit, I've got the same issue with things like, forgeries. Like quite often if a new document's discovered or comes to light, my instinct is to say, I bet it's a forgery. And lots of the time it's not. Gospel of Judas is not a forgery. But I remember when it came out, I thought, I wonder if that's a forgery. It wasn't, So yeah, there is that. Yeah, there is that kind of buzzkill thing. I just really hope that someone discovers a really good, ancient, definitely first century gospel where I can go, woohoo, great, we've found it. And I agree with you all, just so I can prove I'm not just being bloody minded.
Yeah, I feel the same way with like a first or second century papyrus of Josephus, and we can see is the testimony of Josephus. How much was it meddled with? I'm the same way. I'm so cynical. Like, I want these to be real. Like, oh my gosh, an Aramaic Colonel Thomas that dates to 50 CE. Like, oh my God, that would be amazing. But I'm always
fantastic. Yeah,
but I'm always a little too cynical.
It's one of the reasons that I always am a bit disappointed when people try and guess what your kind of ideological or theological commitments are and all the rest of it to try and diagnose why you're saying something, because quite often if you do try and sort of psychoanalyze, yourself, the reasons are rarely purely ideological or theological. There might just be you really enjoy the mystery of the thing, or you really enjoy the puzzle of the thing, or you really just feel that you've got some insight that, maybe other people haven't, had in quite the same way. So, hey ho. But but yeah, I mean, my biggest hope is that someone discovers the Egerton Gospel. We've got these tiny little fragments of the Egerton Gospel, and that does look genuinely, potentially primitive. And I would just love it if we could get like someone could find a complete copy in Coptic or Ethiopic or something of that. That would just be absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. Just for the audience, can you just explain a little bit what the Egerton Gospel is? Because it is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, we only have some fragments of it, and a little bit like the Gospel of Thomas, it's got some parallels with the Synoptic Gospels, and some unique material, but it also has some material that looks kind of Johannine, like John's Gospel, and so it's particularly interesting because it looks like it's got some kind of Synoptic plus Johannine flavor to it, but we've got so little of it, we can't tell how far that kind of thing goes. And yeah, we've only got a very small amount of it. It's called Egerton just because of the guy that first published the Papyrus Egerton 2. We find a tiny bit more of it since, but it's only a tiny bit. So yeah, and that's the case with loads and loads of ancient gospels. We only have them in fragmentary form.
I mean, if I was suddenly granted the power of omniscience, I'd just be like, okay, where are the last papyrus hoards in Egypt? Is there another Nag Hammadi, something out there that we could find? The entire Josephus, the entire Egerton, that's just...
Yeah, that would be so great, wouldn't it? Yeah. I mean, of course, people often say to me things like, well, what would he do, if Q gets discovered? And I always find it's a really difficult question to answer because obviously I believe it didn't exist. So it's a really strange question to be asking. I suppose the question comes from the idea that maybe I'm just like so stubborn that even if it were discovered, I wouldn't believe it. But I mean, I think the thing is, when you look at hypothetical texts like Q, they don't look very much like actual extant texts like the Gospel of Thomas. And one of the things that got me into studying Thomas in the first place was people kept saying to me, all right, so if Q didn't exist, what do you make of the Gospel of Thomas? And so I thought, well, I have to have an answer to that. And so when I started studying Thomas, the first thing I noticed is I think it doesn't look much like Q. And you'll still hear people saying it. You'll still hear people saying, oh, Thomas, yeah, it's a document like Q. Well, for a start, the material that's in Thomas has parallels to all the strands of gospel material. It has, like, if you want to talk in old-fashioned terms, it's got Q, it's got Mark, it's got M, it's got L, and it's got everything in between those things. Or in my terms, it's got stuff unique to Matthew, stuff unique to Mark, stuff unique to Luke, things that are in common between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, things that are in common between Matthew and Luke, and so on. And it's just amazing how much it spreads that thing. So it isn't anything like Q in that sense. And also, Q's kind of has these long discourses. If you the way people reconstruct Q, it's got these long discourses and it's got some kind of narrative logic. And Thomas isn't structured like that at all.
So the whole argument that there's a strong parallel, that Q is also some sort of sayings gospel, just really not the case.
I don't think so, because Q is more, well, Q looks to me like what it is, which is the bits of Matthew's and Luke's Mark and material artificially extracted, which is why, and given that most of what Matthew adds to Mark is sayings material, of course, when Luke's copying that stuff, it's going to be sayings material. But what's so interesting is that Matthew does add one or two narratives to Mark, like the centurion's boy, and lo and behold, there it is in Luke, because Luke likes that stuff. And, so I mean, Q looks like what it is, which is the bits Luke extracted from Matthew. At least that's the way that I look at it. It doesn't, it's not really a sayings gospel.
Well, one argument from April Laconic that I do agree with and find really tantalizing is like the use cases of Thomas as some sort of handbook or manual that you would use in like oral delivery. Like you can imagine a preacher there on the street having his little handy handbook of sayings. I do like that idea, because otherwise, what's this text doing? Like, what is it doing liturgically or pedagogically? Like, it's quite odd just to be.
And we do the same today. I mean, we still have books of quotations, and in the internet era, we have whole web pages with wise quotations from a particular individual on it. So I mean, they were no different from that. We can think of it as like a little kind of quotations book. I mean, what is interesting is that the Coptic text and so we only have one complete text of Thomas, which is in Coptic. It does have these little symbols. I mean, I'm not sure how many viewers will know about nomina sacra, but these is where people abbreviated divine names like God, Jesus, or even sometimes things like the word cross. They abbreviated them and put a line over the top. And a lot of people say, well, that shows that, these might have been being used in worship. And it's possible that the Gospel of Thomas was used in worship communities. I mean, that does, of course, then raise the question, what do we mean by a worshiping community that's using Thomas? I mean, we shouldn't be thinking about kind of 21st century, kind of churches with pews and then kind of superimposing it. I mean, a worship community for the Thomas community might have just been them all sitting around in a room speculating on the meaning of something like be passers by, and you have the guru who says, well, what do you all think that this means? And then they all kind of pop up with their ideas, and then the guru maybe says, but the true meaning is, or or maybe they sat around and prayed about the I don't know, but I do think that it is a communal document, and it's something that you would get together and talk about with other people and speculate about. It invites you in. It invites you to say, what on earth does this mean? And to that extent, it's a little bit like people that are used to contemporary Bible study, where you take the Bible passage as an invitation to do more exegesis and application to current life. I think Thomas is probably a little bit like that, in that you've got the interpreters going, I wonder what that means. Well, let's compare it with this saying. There's another similar saying here, and that sort of thing. I suppose one thing about Thomas specifically is the character of Thomas, and he does start becoming quite an important character in the early second century. I mean, I would date John's Gospel also to the early second century. And you go through the Synoptics, Thomas is only mentioned once in Matthew, once in Mark, once in Luke, and it's just in the list of disciples. Nothing. It doesn't even have his first name. Thomas isn't a name. Thomas just means twin. It's the Aramaic word for twin. So, he must have been called something else. The Gospel of Thomas says he was called Judas Thomas. That was his name. He was Judas the twin. And you can easily imagine why people started calling him Judas the twin, because you've got a more notorious disciple called Judas, and people didn't want to confuse this one with that Judas one. Yeah. And so one of the things that Thomas has in common with John, even though it doesn't have much no verbatim agreement with Thomas, and only just tiny little kind of conceptual parallels with John, but it does agree with John in thinking that this character of Thomas is important. And so that is kind of fascinating. Why is it that in the second century you get this character, this disciple suddenly becomes much more important? And it doesn't stop with the Gospel of Thomas and with the Gospel of John, because if you look at the Acts of Thomas, and in the Acts of Thomas, this character actually looks like Jesus. I mean, he's properly Jesus's twin, and that's kind of fascinating. Did that emerge from the idea of imitating Jesus, becoming like Jesus, becoming one with Jesus, that you then eventually make it such that the character of Thomas actually looks like Jesus? And so Acts of Thomas, which is probably early 3rd century, so it's a little bit later, but still relatively early, is playing with that. So that's a fascinating element in Christian origins, which we tend to forget. And in later Christian tradition, the character of Thomas, the idea that Thomas is somehow Jesus's twin, just gradually dissipates in favor of this is partly what happens with canonical bias, because John's Gospel is in the canon and John's Gospel is read in church. The version of Thomas that they remember is Doubting Thomas. And so that becomes the central way that you even think about that character, not Thomas the twin, who has this kind of great wisdom and insight into Jesus's sayings.
Yeah, this points to reminds me of a theory or an analogy that I like, and I think you've used in your classroom as well, which is the fan fiction impulse. In early Christian literature, you just get this really minor character that appears only in one small scene, and then suddenly the fan fiction impulse is like, well, who is this character? What was his story? Let's give him a whole backstory. And I see that completely with Thomas, where again, just mentioned so briefly, has this very iconic scene in John, and then suddenly he's the twin of Jesus who gets the secret knowledge handed to him either in the Gospel of Thomas or in the book of Thomas the Contender.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, very much so. And I've sometimes toyed with the idea of writing a book about the character of Thomas in early Christianity, because if you go to India, for example, you spend time in Chennai or in Kerala, you'll find also Thomas has just left this amazing impact on the place, and usually he's characterized along the Johannine lines. It is usually doubting Thomas of John 20 that you're looking at, but not always. There are little bits of the apocryphal Thomas, for want of a better term, that have made it into that tradition too. And the Acts of Thomas already has that Indian component in there. So there's definitely a really interesting story to be told about the character. And you can do similar things with other characters who are relatively minor characters in the Gospels, but then explode into life later on, with kind of speculation and rewriting. And that's really how things should be. I mean, it's all, I mean, we say fan fiction sometimes in a relatively disparaging way, but some fan fiction can be better than the things that it's based on.
Yeah, the phrase itself seems a bit derogatory when applied to a sacred text like the New Testament, but I use it, from as a Star Wars fan, where I would watch Star Wars, and there's that famous cantina scene in A New Hope where you have all these aliens and the band up there, and suddenly you realize there's all these stories written about these characters. So we can maybe say the spin-off literature impulse if we want to avoid the phrase fan fiction. And I think that was a motivating factor for a lot of early Christian authors who, out of devotion, took these characters and gave them broader stories.
That actually, I mean, I love those kind of analogies like the one you're using with Star Wars, because it actually does help us to break through some of these canonical boundaries. I mean, I've been watching Star Trek Strange New Worlds, where Captain Pike is the hero, and he's in the pilot of the original Star Trek, and then briefly resurrected later on. But I mean, now he's just like become this massive character in the Star Trek universe, and then you have to, and that's not a fan fiction. I mean, it's like on Paramount, and it's like got people involved with the original and so on, and so you have to say then what does it mean to talk about canon? And I think one of the problems with the way that we study early Christianity is that we have too restricted a definition of canon, and we don't open up those boundaries and explore the literature, for its real interest. We kind of close it down for obvious reasons, because people have known, the New Testament canon for such a long time. But it's so much more exciting to open up those boundaries and look at other examples of early Christian literature. I mean, it helped. Also, I think I would say to my students, it helps me reread the New Testament text as well. It gives you, when you look at the way that other texts interact with them, it gives you fresh insight onto those texts as well. So it's not like we're parking the canonicals and then exploring this other world. We're actually also reinterpreting the canonicals when we do that.
Yeah, it helps us envision a type of Christianity that did not have as firm boundaries between apocryphal and canon. And apparently Matthew and Luke also did not have those strict boundaries, because they happily took Mark and reworked it.
That's right, exactly. Yeah. And it's what, even if you're looking at, say the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're doing the same thing with Genesis. You look at the Genesis Apocryphon and lots of other, material from the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're taking stuff which was clearly in some sense sacred scripture to them and doing rewrites of it. So people have always done that. It's not this idea of a kind of, and to be fair, people still do it today. So one of the most conservative Jesus projects is The Chosen, which is this TV series based on, and 95% of it is made up. Like, yes, they take gospel material, but loads and loads and loads of it's fiction. There's whole episodes which are not found anywhere in the Gospels, or it'll be like one line spun into a whole episode. And I think that's great. I think that's exactly what people should be doing. But this isn't like some weird kind of radical kind of thing. This is something that Christians themselves, even the most conservative Christians, are still doing, is they're retelling the story in fresh ways.
Well, Dr. Goodacre, this is a lot for us to think about, but thank you for coming on the show.
That's a pleasure. I've really enjoyed the chat.